In this section of the course, we're going to be taking a look at the range object, which is the most popular object in the Excel object model. A range object is a grouping of one or more cells in a single worksheet. So to clarify, Excel does not have the concept of a cell object. Rather, a cell is just a range that targets only one cell. The range object is kind of the catch-all tool that we use to target anything from one cell to a clump of cells to all the cells on a single spreadsheet. A range is built around A1 notation, which is a technical term for a concept that we're actually pretty familiar with. A1 notation simply means that we refer to a column with a letter and we refer to a row by a number. So A1 comes from the top left cell in a worksheet, which is right here, cell A1. We use the letter from the column and we use the number for the row, and that represents how we're targeting the address of a cell. As we know, the range object is a property of the worksheet object. The worksheet object is nested under the worksheets collection. The worksheets collection is found within the workbook object. The workbook object is nested within the workbooks collection, and that collection of workbooks is nested under the application object, which sits at the very top of the Excel hierarchy. A range can provide a qualified reference, which means we can tell it specifically what workbook to use and what worksheet to target in that workbook, but we can also target a range without mentioning any of those characteristics. A range without a qualifier will assume the active workbook and the active sheet. The active workbook, of course, is the workbook that is currently active. It's the one that we're clicked into, that's selected within our Excel application. The active sheet is whatever sheet we currently have selected within that workbook. So for example, in this Excel workbook, I have two sheets, sheet 1 and sheet 2. The one that is highlighted, the one that is activated, is called the active sheet. So sheet 1 is the active sheet. Now we have to be careful here because there's actually two types of sheets available in Excel. A regular spreadsheet, which is the one we see right here, or a data sheet. And the second one is called a chart sheet, which is used to render a chart, like a pie chart or a bar graph. In that case, those chart sheets don't actually have a range property on them. So if the active sheet is a chart sheet, then the range property will not exist and we're going to run into an error. So whenever we have the potential to run into that error by having chart sheets, it's a better idea to include explicit references to the actual sheet that we want to target. In this course, we're not going to be diving into charts until much later, so we don't have to worry about that right now. All of our sheets are going to be data sheets, spreadsheets. So whenever we use range, we can be certain that we're not going to run into that bug. In this lesson, I want to dive into the select method, which simply selects or highlights a range on the worksheet. This can be a particularly useful tool when you want to double check that the reference that you're providing to a range is proper and that you're targeting the right thing. So let's take a look. I'm going to define a procedure here called highlight range. And we're going to do some pretty simple statements right here. But again, this is just to get us thinking about what a range can hold. So of course, a range can select a single cell. So for example, I can do range right here, target a cell like B5, and let's execute the select method on the range. All that's going to do is highlight the cell. So when I execute this, we can see the little green box has moved to cell B5. Whenever we select a range in Excel, we actually get access to that very same range with a property called selection. So right below here, what I can do is target selection, which right now is cell B5, and let's say write a value into there like hooray. So I'm just going to execute this, and we're going to see that that value is going to be populated in cell B5. Now right now you may be looking at this and saying, what's the point of this? Can't I just do range B5 dot value equals hooray? And the answer is you absolutely can. But imagine a macro that you'd be running where you want to ask the user to actually select some cells. So you want the user to actually do the highlighting. What you can do is target that highlighted collection of cells with something like selection. And that allows us to be very dynamic. Our macros no longer even have to reference any specific range because we're going to dynamically be able to figure it out by what the user has selected. So whatever is currently selected, for example, this selection or this selection, this is going to be represented by the selection keyword or property within VBA. So range actually offers us a wide variety of syntactical options to refer to a cell or collection of cells. So we know here that we can select a single cell by just writing it in as the A1 cell reference. What we can also do here is actually specify a range or a collection of cells with a colon. So if I want to target, for example, cells B3 through E9, I can write it like that. That's going to select that entire range of cells. We can also separate these arguments and put them in as two different arguments to that range. So what we can do here is write our first argument, which is going to represent the top left corner of the range that we want to target. And the second argument is going to represent the bottom right corner of the range that we want to target. So we're basically creating almost like a square where we're specifying the top left and the top right. It is going to result in the exact same thing. So we can see here we're selecting the exact same box. Two different ways to accomplish the exact same task. We can also use the range syntax to reference a whole column or a whole row. So for example, if I want to target all of column E, what I can do is just write E through E. Then when I execute this, I'm going to select just that column. If I want to target more than one column at a time, for example, let's say I want to target B through F, I just begin with my first column, colon, my ending column. That's going to select all of the columns there. I can do the exact same syntax for rows, but instead of providing letters, of course, I provide numbers to represent rows. So if I want to target, let's say, row 3, I can just do row 3 through row 3. That's going to target that. And let's say I want to target rows 7 through 12. It's just the beginning row, a colon, the ending row, and that's going to select that entire range of rows. Here's another cool feature that's available with range. We can actually make up a range of different non-contiguous cells. What that means is the cells don't have to be connected to each other. That's what non-contiguous means. So, for example, let's say I wanted to select cell A1 and then another clump of cells like B2 through, let's say, B3. What I can do is actually put a comma after my initial reference and then put the other reference that I want to target. So when I execute this with F5, you can see we're targeting both cell A1 right here, as well as all of the cells in B2 to B3. Let's add another range here. Let's say I want to target something completely far away from those. Let's say cell D9 through G15. When I execute this, you can see we're going to target those 3 non-contiguous ranges, and all of the familiar syntax is going to apply. So once we have those selected, we can use the selection to write in a value to all of them. For example, let's do hooray again, hooray, execute that. So now we can see we've targeted these separated ranges and performed some kind of identical process on them. It doesn't have to be writing a value. We can, for example, perform some kind of formatting process or call some kind of method on all these cells. The range object does not actually have to be cells that are strictly connected to each other. They can be separate like here. All you have to do is separate those range references with a comma in a single string using the familiar colon syntax, and that way we can target these non-contiguous ranges. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We talked a little bit about the range object and the select method, which simply selects a range or highlights it so we can see it in the interface and confirm that it's the proper thing that we're referencing. Once it's selected, of course, it also becomes referenced by something called the selection property. So selection right here is the same valid range object, and then we can invoke whatever methods we want or use whatever properties we want on that range object. Again, the advantage of this is we can allow the user to select something first and then ask them to execute a macro that's going to target their selection, and that way we can target a dynamic range. We also talked about the many different arguments that we can give to the string to target a range. We can target a cell, a clump of cells, we can target a column, a row, we can even target non-contiguous ranges. There's a lot of power in this simple range syntax. That's all there is to cover here, and throughout this section we're going to be diving into a lot of different things related to range. It is the most popular object available in the Excel object model. Most of our operations in Excel deal with data, writing it, manipulating it, etc., and that takes place in the range object, so that's to be predicted. I'll see you in the next lesson.